He slammed his fist on the hood of his truck so hard the metal dented. That was the night Navy veteran Jake Mercer calloused hands grease under his nails. 10-year-old daughter asleep in the cab looked up at a woman in a $4,000 dress stepping out of a black car and said the one sentence that was never supposed to leave his mouth. She didn't walk away. She leaned in closer. And that single moment, it cracked open a life Jake had spent 4 years sealing shut. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. The gala wasn't his world. Jake Mercer knew that the second he pulled his dented Ford F-150 through the service gate of Charleston Harbor and saw the valets parking Bentleys like they were doing God's work. He wasn't here for the champagne or the string quartet drifting across the warm September water. He was here because Dawson, his foreman, his only full-time employee, and the closest thing he had to a brother, had thrown out his back that afternoon, and somebody had to finish sealing the hull on Slip 7 before the morning tide shifted everything. So Jake was the somebody. He always was. He cut the engine, sat for a second in the dark cab, and glanced in the rearview mirror. Lily was curled in the back seat, her dark hair fanned across her navy hoodie mouth, slightly open, one sneaker half off her foot. 10 years old, and already sleeping like the world owed her rest. He'd picked her up from Mrs. Carver's after school, figured he'd be done in 90 minutes. That was 3 hours ago. "Sorry, baby girl," he said quietly, even though she couldn't hear him. He got out, grabbed his tool bag from the bed, and walked down to the dock without looking at the party happening 40 yards away. He worked the way he always worked. Focused, methodical. A little angry at the silence that used to feel peaceful and now just felt empty. The hull on the Adrian May, a 54-foot sloop owned by some orthopedic surgeon in Mount Pleasant, had a hairline fracture along the port side that the owner's marina hadn't caught. Jake had caught it. That was the job. That was always the job. Find what other people missed. Fix what other people broke. Move on. He was on his knees applying the second coat of sealant when he heard them. 2 women, maybe mid-40s, both in cocktail dresses, standing near the iron railing that separated the dock path from the event lawn. They had champagne flutes and the low conspiratorial voices of women who had drunk just enough to say the things they'd been thinking all night. "Did you see the way Victor was looking at her?" one of them said. "He always looks at her like that, like she's something to be acquired." A low, sharp laugh. To be fair, half the men in that room look at Clara that way. "Clara." Jake didn't look up. He kept working. "She could have anyone she wanted," the first woman said, and there was something in her voice, not envy exactly, but close. Admiration and frustration braided together. "You know what kills me? She doesn't seem to want any of them. Maybe she's smarter than all of us. Or lonelier." Silence for a moment. Then the sound of heels on the dock path moving closer. Jake sat back on his heels, reached for the rag in his back pocket, and that's when he saw her. She wasn't what he expected. He didn't know what he expected. He'd heard the name Beckett his whole life in Charleston. The Beckett family had been fixtures in the harbor economy since before he was born. But whoever he'd imagined when he pictured Clara Beckett, it wasn't this woman. She walked like someone who had learned a long time ago that the world was going to watch her whether she wanted it to or not, and had simply decided to walk anyway. Not performative, not theatrical, just certain. Her dress was deep burgundy, simple cut, and she had one hand holding a glass of water, not champagne, and the other hanging at her side like she was resisting the urge to check her phone. She passed within 10 feet of him. He didn't mean to say anything. He genuinely did not mean to open his mouth. But he'd been on his knees for 3 hours, thinking about nothing good, and something about the way those 2 women had talked about her. She could have anyone she wanted. She doesn't seem to want any of them had lodged in his chest like a splinter. And when she walked past and glanced his way with those dark, tired eyes, the words just came out. "Whoever ends up next to you," Jake said, his voice rougher than he intended, "is a lucky guy." She stopped. He immediately wanted to drown himself in the 12 feet of harbor water to his left. She turned. Not sharply, slowly. Like she was deciding whether to be amused or offended and hadn't landed yet. He was still on his knees holding a sealant brush, wearing a Carhartt jacket with a tear in the left sleeve. He probably smelled like marine epoxy. He was almost certainly the least impressive person within a quarter mile of her. "What did you just say?" she asked. Her voice was lower than he expected. Steady. She wasn't flustered. She wasn't smiling yet. "I said—" He stopped, cleared his throat. "I said whoever ends up next to you is lucky." He paused. "Ma'am." The corner of her mouth moved, just barely. "Ma'am?" she repeated. "I'm sorry, that was—" "I didn't mean to. I've been down here for 3 hours, and apparently my filter gave out around hour 2. She looked at him for a long moment, not at his jacket or his hands or his truck visible through the gate. At him. At his face. Something about that directness made his ribs feel tight. "I was hoping," she said quietly, almost like she was talking to herself, "that it would be you." Then she walked away. Jake stayed exactly where he was for a full 30 seconds. He didn't move. He didn't breathe right. He stared at the spot where she'd been standing and felt something he hadn't felt in 4 years crack open in his chest, like a door that was never supposed to open again. He went back to the hull. He finished the coat. He did everything right, but his hands weren't quite steady for the rest of the night. He didn't sleep well. That wasn't new sleep, had been a negotiation since Rachel died. The deal was always the same. Jake gave sleep 3 or 4 hours in the early morning, and sleep gave him back something that looked like functioning. But that night, the negotiation broke down early. He lay in the dark of the house that still sometimes felt like hers. The yellow kitchen she'd painted herself. The bookshelves she'd built crooked on purpose because she said, "Perfect shelves are for people with nothing interesting on them." And he stared at the ceiling and thought about a woman he didn't know, saying, "I was hoping it would be you." What did that even mean? She was Clara Beckett. She ran a maritime development company that had shaped the entire harbor district. She sat on 3 boards, had been profiled in Southern Business Quarterly, and had more connections in this city than Jake had miles on his truck. She was by every reasonable measure not a person whose life intersected with his in any meaningful way. He'd said something stupid in a weak moment. She'd said something back that didn't make sense. That was the whole story. That was all it was. He rolled over, closed his eyes, told himself to sleep. Lily knocked on his door at 6:15. "Dad?" A pause. "Dad, I'm out of the good cereal." "There's oatmeal." A long, suffering silence from behind the door. "The oatmeal is not the good cereal. The oatmeal is healthy cereal." "That's not what I said." He was up by 6:20. The shipyard in the morning had a smell he'd loved since he was 12 years old. Salt water and metal and cut wood and the particular diesel and oil scent of engines being coaxed back to life. His father had brought him here. His grandfather had worked 2 docks down back when the whole harbor was different, back when it was all working boats and no events venues. Mercer Marine Repair. The sign had needed repainting for 2 years. He kept not getting around to it. Dawson was there by 7, walking stiffly and pretending his back was fine. "You should be home," Jake said. "You finished the Adrian May seal?" Dawson asked, ignoring him completely. "Second coat's done. Needs to set until tonight." "Good." Dawson lowered himself carefully onto the dock box like a man sitting on a cactus. "Heard you were down near the gala last night." Jake kept his eyes on the work order clipboard. "I was on slip 7. Heard you talk to Clara Beckett." Jake looked up slowly. "Who told you that?" Dawson shrugged in the way he always shrugged, which meant he wasn't going to say, and Jake wasn't going to find out. The man had a network of information sources that would have made a CIA analyst jealous. "People talk. You know how it is down here." "I said 4 words to her." "Was one of them Lucky?" Jake set the clipboard down. "How does anyone know that?" "Was it a good conversation?" "It was 11 seconds, Dawson." The older man smiled slow, knowing the kind of smile that Jake had been watching him deploy since they were both young men before the Navy, before Rachel, before all of it. 11 seconds can change everything, brother. That's the whole story of my 3rd marriage. Please don't tell me about your 3rd marriage again. I'm just saying. Dawson. She's been trying to protect that company from Victor Randall for 8 months, and everybody on this harbor knows her daddy trusted you. Her what? Jake stopped, turned fully. What did you just say? But before Dawson could answer, they both heard the car. A dark blue sedan, no driver, she was driving herself, pulled through the service entrance and stopped near the main workshop. The door opened, and Clara Beckett stepped out wearing slacks, a pale gray blouse, no jewelry except small gold earrings. She had a leather portfolio under her arm and the look of someone who had made a decision and wasn't second-guessing it. Jake felt the back of his neck go warm. "Mr. Mercer," she called, not tentatively, just directly like she'd been saying his name for years and had simply run out of reasons not to. He walked toward her. "Miss Beckett." Up close in daylight, without a gala in the background, she looked different. Not less, just real. There were circles under her eyes that hadn't been there at midnight or had been hidden by the party light. Her jaw had the particular set of someone managing something heavy and had been managing it alone for a while. "I need a hull assessment report for the Harriet Blue," she said. "She's been sitting in dry dock at the North Slip for 6 weeks. My harbor master says she's sound. I want an independent eye." "I can get you that," Jake said. "I need it by Thursday." "I can do Thursday." She nodded, started to turn away, then stopped. And for a moment, just a fraction, the professional mask dropped an inch. Her eyes met his, with a directness that hit him somewhere behind the sternum. "I don't usually do that," she said quietly. He waited. "Last night. I don't usually—" She paused. "I don't know why I said what I said." He looked at her for a long moment. The harbor sounds rigging gulls, a distant engine filled the space between them. "I don't either," he said honestly. "But I'm glad I said it." The corner of her mouth pulled again, that same almost smile from the night before, like something she was only half allowing herself to feel. "Thursday," she said. "Thursday," he confirmed. She walked back to her car, got in, drove out through the service gate. Jake stood there until the dust settled, and Dawson appeared at his left elbow with a coffee cup and the expression of a man who had absolutely been watching the whole thing from behind the workshop door. "Don't," Jake said. "Didn't say a word," Dawson said pleasantly, handing over the coffee. Jake took it. Took a long drink. Stared out at the water where the morning light was doing what it always did, making everything look like it might possibly still be worth something. He thought about what Dawson had started to say before she drove up. "Her daddy trusted you. What did that mean?" He looked down at the coffee, then back at the gate where her car had been. He didn't have answers yet, but for the first time in 4 years he was asking questions he actually wanted answered. And somewhere in the back of his chest, behind all the grief and the routine and the careful walls he'd built to keep mornings manageable and nights survivable, something that felt dangerously like hope was putting its weight against the door. He told himself not to let it. He knew already it was too late. Thursday came faster than Jake expected. He'd spent the 2 days between telling himself the whole thing was nothing, a job, an assessment report. Clara Beckett needed an independent eye on the Harriet Blue. He was going to give her one. She was going to write him a check, and that was going to be the complete and total extent of their relationship. He repeated that to himself Tuesday morning while he was making Lily's lunch. He repeated it Wednesday afternoon while he was running torque checks on an engine block. He repeated it so many times that Dawson finally looked up from the workbench and said without any preamble whatsoever, "You're doing that thing where you talk yourself out of something before it even starts." "I'm not talking," Jake said. "You're doing it in your head. I can tell because your jaw's been tight for 2 days and you keep looking at the gate." "I'm watching for deliveries." "The last delivery was yesterday at noon." Dawson set down his wrench. "She's coming Thursday, Jake. Just let Thursday happen." Jake didn't answer, which was in its own way an answer. Thursday happened. She pulled through the service gate at 9 sharp. Same dark blue sedan, driving herself again. Jake noticed that a woman who could absolutely have a driver chose not to have one. He noticed it, and then told himself to stop noticing things about her. She stepped out with the leather portfolio again, but this time she was in flat shoes and dark slacks rolled at the ankle, and the pale gray blouse was traded for a navy jacket that looked like it had been lived in rather than just worn. More real than the gala version. More real than the first morning version even. "Mr. Mercer," she said. "Ms. Beckett." He nodded toward the North Slip. "She's this way." They walked side by side along the dock, and the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, which somehow made it more uncomfortable. Jake had spent most of his adult life around men who understood how to work in silence, how to be next to somebody without needing to fill the air. He hadn't expected that from her. They reached the Harriet Blue. She was a 62-foot schooner, old money written into every inch of her mahogany deck trim, hand-stitched sails folded in the stern, the kind of boat that had been cared for across generations until someone stopped caring. 6 weeks in dry dock had been unkind. Not fatal, but unkind. Jake walked the hull without speaking, running his hand along the fiberglass seams, pressing into the gel coat at the waterline, crouching to examine the keel joint. Clara stood back and watched him work. She didn't ask questions yet. He respected that. After 10 minutes, he straightened up and turned to face her. "Your harbormaster's half right," he said. "Structurally, she's not going to sink. But the keel joint on the port side has stress fracturing that goes deeper than a surface inspection catches. You need a full resin injection before she goes back in the water, and the standing rigging on the foremast has 3 swagged fittings that are past service life." He paused. "If you push her back out without addressing those, you're not looking at a catastrophic failure immediately, but inside 18 months, you're looking at a mast-down event offshore." Clara wrote in her portfolio without looking up. Estimated repair timeline. 3 weeks for the keel work if I pull 2 guys off their current rotation. Rigging I can sub to Callaway Rigging in North Charleston. They'll turn it around in a week. Cost? He gave her the number. She didn't flinch, which told him she'd already done her own math, and his number was in the reasonable column. "I'll want the full written report by end of day tomorrow," she said. "If you can manage it." "I can manage it." She closed the portfolio. And then neither of them moved toward the car, which meant the job part was done, and something else was still happening, and they both knew it. "Can I ask you something?" Jake said. She looked at him. "You're going to anyway. The other morning Dawson said something." He stopped. Chose his words carefully, the way he'd learned to do in the Navy, when the thing you said next could change the whole situation. "He said your father trusted me. I've been turning that over for 2 days, and I don't know what it means. I met your father exactly twice. Once when I was 26, and he hired me to refasten the bronze hardware on the Lady Cecile. And once at a Harbor Association meeting about 7 years ago, where we stood next to each other for maybe 10 minutes and talked about whether diesel emissions regs were going to kill the charter industry." Clara was very still. "That's not nothing," she said quietly. "It's not much. You'd be surprised what my father noticed in 10 minutes. She looked out at the Harriet Blue for a moment, and something moved across her face that she didn't entirely control. "He kept a journal. 32 years of journals. I've been reading them since he passed." She paused. "Your name is in there more than once." Jake felt something shift under him, like the dock had moved slightly. "What does it say?" She looked back at him. Her eyes were steady, but there was something behind them, something careful and heavy that she'd been carrying for a while. "I'm still figuring out what to do with that information," she said. "When I know, I'll tell you." It wasn't a full answer, but it was an honest one, and Jake had spent enough years around people who gave him polished non-answers to recognize the difference. "All right," he said. She almost smiled. "All right. I'm not going to push you." "Most people push," she said. "I'm not most people." She held his gaze for 1 beat longer than the conversation required. Then she picked up her portfolio and walked back toward the service gate, and Jake watched her go, and did not tell himself it was nothing this time, because he was tired of lying to himself about things that were clearly something. He went back to work. But the keel joint held his attention about 30% less than it should have for the rest of the afternoon. That evening, Lily was doing homework at the kitchen table when Jake came in, and she looked up at him, the way she sometimes did with those dark eyes that were so much her mother's. It still caught him off guard and said, "You're smiling." "I'm not smiling." "You were smiling when you came in. Your eyes do this thing." She demonstrated squinting and lifting her chin slightly in an impression of him that was either deeply accurate or deeply unfair. "I have no idea what you're talking about," Jake said, opening the refrigerator. Was it about a girl? He pulled out 2 water bottles and set one in front of her. Do your homework. Lily grinned and went back to her math worksheet, and Jake stood at the counter and stared at the wall and thought about a woman who said, "I'm still figuring out what to do with that information." He thought about it longer than was reasonable. He accepted that about himself and moved on. The next morning, the report was done by 11. He drove it over to the Beckett and Company offices himself instead of emailing it, which he told himself was professional courtesy, and acknowledged privately was not entirely that. The building was a converted shipping warehouse on the harbor's east end, exposed brick-high ceilings. Old bones with new purpose, which Jake found himself thinking was a good description of several things he'd encountered lately. The receptionist took the report envelope, started to tell him she'd let Ms. Beckett know, and then Clara appeared in the doorway of the corner office like she'd heard the door open. "Jake," she said. Not Mr. Mercer, just Jake. Like the professional distance had moved a step, without either of them formally deciding to move it. "Brought the report," he said, holding it up. "I see that." She looked at the envelope, then at him. "Do you have an hour?" He didn't answer immediately, which she seemed to take as a yes. "Come in," she said. The office was orderly, but not sterile. There were framed harbor charts on the walls, old ones hand-drawn, the kind that predated GPS by 100 years. A model of a 2-masted schooner on the credenza that Jake recognized immediately as a friendship sloop design early 20th century. A photograph on the corner of the desk, Clara and an older man on a boat deck squinting into the sun, both laughing. Her father. "Sit down," she said, moving behind the desk. He sat. She opened the report, scanned the first page with the focus of someone who actually reads things rather than skims them, then set it down and looked at him directly. "Before we talk about the Harriet Blue," she said, "I want to talk about something else." "Okay." "Victor Randall is moving to acquire a controlling stake in Beckett and Company," she said. "He's been building his position for 8 months. He has enough committed shareholders to call a special meeting, and if it goes his way, he takes operational control of the company, restructures the commercial division, which means he eliminates the harbor repair subsidies my father built into the operating charter, and the independent yards along this stretch of waterfront, including yours, lose their preferred maintenance contracts." She said all of this evenly, the way people talk about things they've run through in their heads so many times, the emotion has been temporarily worn smooth. He's been positioning this as a modernization play, but what he actually wants is the waterfront real estate. The boats and the yards are just noise to him. Jake said nothing for a moment. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because it affects you." "There's more than that." She held his gaze. "There's more than that," she agreed. "The journals," he said. She stood up and went to the credenza, opened the bottom drawer and took out a small sealed envelope, yellowed slightly at the edges, the kind of envelope that had been somewhere for a long time. She set it on the desk in front of him. He looked at it. His name was written on the outside in handwriting he didn't recognize. "My father wrote that 4 years before he died," Clara said. "He told his attorney it was to be held until, and this is an exact quote from the instruction letter, until the right moment, or until Clara is brave enough to find it herself." Her voice was steady, but her jaw was tight. "I found it 3 weeks ago." Jake looked at the envelope. He didn't reach for it yet. "I don't understand," he said. "Open it." He picked it up. The paper was heavy quality stock. He broke the seal carefully, the way he handled old hardware, aware that some things once forced don't go back together. Inside was a single page. He read it. He read it twice. He set it down on the desk and sat back in his chair and stared at the harbor chart on the wall for what felt like a long time. "He put shares in trust," Jake said, "under my name. 4%, Clara said. Non-transferable, non-dilutable. Structured so they can only be voted by you directly." She paused. "My father trusted almost no one outside the family with anything real. But he put your name on that trust document. Jake and I have been trying to understand why for 3 weeks. I was a 26-year-old dock worker when I met him," Jake said. "I refastened some hardware." "You told him the boat wasn't seaworthy," Clara said. "His own marina had cleared it. His harbor master had cleared it. His head of operations had cleared it. And you, a 26-year-old dock worker he'd hired for a day job, told him to his face that the boat wasn't seaworthy, and explained exactly why, and you didn't soften it, and you didn't worry about whether he wanted to hear it. She looked at him. He wrote about that in his journal for 3 pages. He said it was the most honest thing anyone had said to him in years. He said he'd been surrounded by people who told him what he wanted to hear for so long, he'd forgotten what a man with no angle sounded like. Jake didn't say anything. 4% doesn't sound like much, Clara continued. But Victor has been working the shareholder base for 8 months. He's within 2% of what he needs. My lawyers tell me those 4% votes are the difference between me keeping operational control and Victor Randall turning this company into a real estate platform and gutting everything my father spent 30 years building. She held his eyes. Which means you are at this exact moment in time the most important person in this company. The weight of it landed on Jake slowly, the way serious things did not all at once, but piece by piece, each piece heavier than the last. He never told me, Jake said. No. He put my name on a legal document and never said a word to me. That was my father, Clara said, and something in her voice softened unexpectedly. Grief and love and exasperation all tangled together. He believed in doing things quietly and letting them matter loudly. She paused. He was right about most things. Jake looked down at the letter again, at the handwriting of a man he'd spoken to twice, who had apparently watched him for 10 minutes and decided he was worth trusting with something real. What do you need from me? He asked. Clara looked at him for a long moment. And in that moment, behind the professional composure and the careful steadiness, he could see what she actually was. A woman who had been fighting alone for 8 months, protecting something that mattered, afraid in ways she hadn't let herself say out loud. I need you to show up to the shareholder meeting, she said, and I need you to vote. That's it. That's it. When? 3 weeks. Jake folded the letter, put it back in the envelope, and slid it into the inside pocket of his jacket. He stood up. I'll be there, he said. Clara exhaled barely perceptible, but Jake caught it. Like a rope that had been pulled taut for a long time had just been given an inch of slack. Thank you, she said quietly. He nodded and moved toward the door, then stopped. Can I ask you something else? He said. You're going to anyway. She said the same words as the doc, and this time there was something warmer in them. The night at the gala, he said. What you said. He paused. Did you mean it? The silence between them was not the working silence from the dock. This one had weight and heat, and the particular quality of something both people are afraid to say first. Yes, Clara said. Just that. One word. Quiet and certain, the way she walked, the way she did most things, not theatrical, just true. Jake nodded once, and this time, the almost smile on her face wasn't held back quite so much. He walked out through the converted warehouse, past the brick walls and the harbor charts, and the receptionist, who didn't look up, and stepped out into the warm Charleston morning. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, the letter in his jacket pocket, the weight of 4% and 3 weeks, and one honest word pressing against his ribs. He pulled out his phone and called Dawson. I need you to hold the yard for the rest of the day, he said when Dawson picked up. What happened? I'll explain tonight. A pause. Is it the good kind of complicated or the bad kind? Jake looked out at the harbor, the water catching light the way it always did, indifferent and beautiful and older than all of them. I don't know yet, he said honestly. That's usually the good kind, Dawson said. Jake ended the call. Stood there another moment. Then he walked back to his truck and sat in the cab and took the envelope out of his pocket and read the letter one more time, and thought about a man he'd barely known who had seen something in him worth trusting, and a woman who was in her own careful way beginning to do the same. The 3 weeks before the shareholder meeting were the longest of Jake's life since the months after Rachel died. He told himself he was fine. He told Dawson he was focused. He told Lily he was just busy with work, which she accepted with the particular skepticism of a 10-year-old who had been watching her father closely for 4 years, and had developed excellent instincts about when he was telling the complete truth and when he was telling the convenient version of it. You keep checking your phone, she said one morning over breakfast. "I'm expecting a parts delivery. You checked it 4 times during cartoons last night. Parts deliveries are time-sensitive." Lily looked at him with Rachel's eyes and said nothing, which was somehow louder than anything she could have said out loud. The truth was, Clara had called him twice in the first week after the office meeting, once about the Harriet Blue repair schedule, once about a question in the assessment report. And both calls had lasted longer than the question required, sliding from business into something that wasn't quite personal, but wasn't purely professional either. They talked about the harbor, about her father's journals, about a design project Jake had abandoned 6 years ago, a set of restoration plans for a 1940s-era working schooner that he'd started drawing the year before Rachel got sick and never finished. "You draw?" she asked during the second call. Her voice had that quality it got when she was actually curious about something, a slight lowering, a slowing down, like she was making room for the answer. "Used to," he said. "What happened?" He was quiet for a second. Life got complicated. She didn't push, but she said, "I'd like to see them sometime, if you ever feel like finishing them." He hadn't touched those drawings in 6 years. After the call ended, he went to the filing cabinet in the spare bedroom, the one that still had Rachel's gardening books stacked on top of it, and pulled out the tube where the plans were rolled. He unrolled them on the kitchen table and stood there looking at them for a long time. They were good. Even 6 years later, he could see they were genuinely good. He didn't know what to do with that, so he rolled them back up and put them away and went to bed. But he left the filing cabinet drawer open. Victor Randall made his move in the second week. Jake heard about it from Dawson first, which was how he heard about most things. Dawson had come in that Tuesday morning with the particular energy he had when something was happening that he felt Jake needed to know about immediately, which meant he didn't build up to it at all. "Victor Randall sent a rep to see Pete Calloway yesterday afternoon," Dawson said before Jake had finished his first cup of coffee. Jake set the cup down. Pete Calloway ran Calloway Rigging in North Charleston, the same shop Jake had recommended to Clara for the Harriet Blue's rigging work, and a man who'd been working the harbor longer than almost anyone. "What kind of rep?" Jake asked. "The kind that comes with a briefcase and an offer," Dawson said. "Apparently Randall's people have been working the smaller operators along the waterfront, telling them the new Beckett and Company under his management will guarantee long-term service contracts, better rates than they have now." He paused. Pete told the rep to get off his property, but not everyone's going to say that. Jake thought about that, thought about the math of it. Victor working the shareholder base from above, while simultaneously working the community operators from below, building a story about inevitability that made it easier for nervous people to choose his side. It was smart. Ruthless, but smart. He called Clara. She picked up on the second ring. "I know," she said before he said anything. "How long have you known?" "2 days. My attorney told me." A pause. "He's also filed a motion to challenge the validity of my father's trust document, arguing the share assignment wasn't properly disclosed in the original articles of incorporation." Jake felt something cold move through his chest. Can he do that? He can try. His lawyers are good. Another pause, shorter, harder. "Mine are better." "Clara." "I'm handling it, Jake." "I know you're handling it. That's not why I called." He stopped. "I called because I want to know if you're okay." The silence on the other end lasted long enough that he wondered if he'd said the wrong thing. Then she said very quietly, "No one's asked me that in a while." "I'm asking." Another pause. "I'm tired," she said. "I've been tired for 8 months. But I'm not stopping." A beat. "That's as okay as I can be right now." "That's enough," he said. He could hear her exhale. "Thank you for calling. I'll see you Thursday for the Harriet Blue progress check." "Yes?" A brief silence. "Jake, the drawings. What about them?" "Bring them Thursday." He started to say he didn't know where they were. He stopped himself because that was the convenient version, and he was trying to be done with those. "All right," he said. He brought the drawings Thursday. She spread them out on the big table in the conference room off her office, pushed aside the shareholder documents and the legal briefs and the financial models, and just looked at them. Really looked the way you look at something when you're not performing attention, but actually paying it. Jake stood across the table and watched her face. "These are extraordinary," she said. "They're unfinished. The ones that are done are extraordinary." She traced a line on the hull profile drawing without touching the paper. "Who taught you this?" "My grandfather. He was a boatwright. Old school, lofted everything by hand. No CAD, no computer models. He said if you couldn't draw it, you didn't understand it." Jake paused. "I think about that a lot. Whether I actually understand things or just think I do." Clara looked up at him. "What stopped you from finishing them?" He held her gaze. "My wife got sick the fall after I started these. By the time..." He stopped. "By the time things were different, I didn't know how to go back to them." Clara nodded slowly. She didn't say "I'm sorry" the way most people did, reflexive and fast, filling the space with condolence before they'd really heard the thing. She just sat with it for a moment, which he found was harder to receive, and also better. "Finish them," she said finally. "Clara, I mean it professionally." She straightened up. "My father had been talking for years about a heritage restoration program. Working vessels from the 1930s and 40s brought back to operating condition, used for education and harbor tours. He never got it off the ground because the board wasn't interested, and he couldn't find anyone who understood both the design history and the practical repair side." She looked at him steadily. "I think you're that person." Jake stared at her. "You're offering me a job." "I'm offering you a project, a real one, with funding and a timeline and your name on the design documentation." She paused. "Assuming we still have a company in 3 weeks." The weight of the last part landed between them. "We'll still have a company," Jake said. "You sound certain." "I am certain." She studied him for a moment with those dark, careful eyes. "Why?" "Because you're not going to let it go," he said simply. "And neither am I." Something shifted in her face, not the almost smile this time, something deeper and less controlled. She looked down at the drawings again, and when she looked back up, she had herself composed, but he'd seen the thing underneath. "Roll them up carefully," she said. "I don't want them damaged." He rolled the drawings. She gathered her papers, and they stood on opposite sides of the conference table for a moment, in the kind of silence that had been accumulating between them for 2 weeks, heavy with everything that was true and hadn't been said directly. "When this is over," Jake said. She looked at him. "When the meeting is done and Victor is done and all of this is settled," he said, "I'd like to take you to dinner. Not as a shareholder, not about the company." He paused. "Just dinner." Clara was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "When this is over." Not a no. Not an almost. A when. He drove home with the drawings in the truck bed and something warm and careful sitting in his chest. The storm came 4 days later. It had been building in the Gulf for a week, a late-season tropical system that the forecasters kept revising upward, then downward, then back up again. By Wednesday morning, it was a confirmed tropical storm, tracking directly up the South Carolina coast, expected landfall Thursday night, and the harbor was in full preparation mode. Jake had been through enough of these to move efficiently. Boats pulled equipment secured the Harriet Blue, braced in dry dock with additional support struts. The workshop sealed as tightly as the old building's bones allowed. He sent Dawson home at 4 o'clock Thursday afternoon when the outer band started coming in. "I'll finish the last dock lines," Jake said. "Jake, Lily's at Mrs. Carver's, she's fine. I'll be an hour." He looked at Dawson. "Go home." Dawson went reluctantly, leaving Jake alone on the dock in the rising wind and the first hard bursts of rain. He worked quickly, methodically, moving from cleat to cleat, checking lines and fenders, double-checking the bracing on the dry dock cradles. The harbor had gone from choppy to genuinely rough in the hour since Dawson left, and the light was gray-green and strange the way it got before a serious storm. He was on the last dock line when he heard footsteps. He turned around. Clara was standing at the dock gate in rain gear proper. Marine-grade gear, not a fashionable approximation of it. The kind of yellow slicker you bought because you were actually going to be in weather. Her hair plastered flat against her face in the rain, holding a coiled line over one shoulder. Jake stared at her. "What are you doing here? I called your cell 3 times." She said, walking toward him with the directness that he was coming to understand was just how she moved through the world. "You didn't answer." "I had it in my jackets in the workshop. What are you doing here, Clara?" "I knew you'd be short-handed in the storm. I grew up on this harbor." She held up the coiled line. "Where do you need this?" He looked at her for a moment in the driving rain. There was something almost funny about it. Clara Beckett, CEO, in her proper rain gear with a dock line on her shoulder, standing in a tropical storm on his dock like it was the most natural thing in the world. Except it wasn't funny. It was the opposite of funny. It was the kind of thing that got into your chest and stayed there. "Portside cradle," he said. "The forward brace needs a second line." She went without asking for more direction. Jake watched her find the forward brace in the dark, and the rain set her feet properly on the wet dock and run the line the right way. Bowline off the cleat, right tension, good angle. She'd done this before. She'd grown up doing this. He went back to his own line. They worked together in the storm without talking much, just the occasional short direction, the occasional confirmation, moving around each other with the easy efficiency of people who instinctively understand the same physical language. When the last line was set, they stood together under the workshop overhang while the storm came in earnest rain sheeting sideways across the dock. Both of them soaked, both of them breathing hard from the last 20 minutes of work against the wind. "You didn't have to come," Jake said. "I know," Clara said. "The dock crew could have—" "Jake." She turned and looked at him directly. "I wanted to come. Stop trying to make it smaller than it is." He held her gaze at the dim light under the overhang rain, roaring on the metal roof above them, the harbor churning behind her. "You're going to have to stop doing that," he said. "What?" "Saying the true thing before I get to it. It keeps throwing me off." She laughed. Actually laughed, not the careful almost smile a real laugh surprised out of her, and the sound of it hit Jake somewhere he hadn't expected. She had a good laugh. Unguarded and warm, completely different from the composed professional voice, completely different from even the quiet, honest voice she used when they talked about serious things. It was just her, just Clara laughing in a storm. He wanted to hear it again. They went inside the workshop, and he found 2 dry towels from the emergency kit, while the storm ran its course outside. They sat on the workbench and drank bad coffee from the old drip machine and talked not about the shareholder meeting, not about Victor, not about the shares or the letter or any of it. Clara talked about her father, and the stories were specific and funny and a little heartbreaking. And Jake talked about his grandfather teaching him to loft a hull by hand, and about the first boat he'd ever repaired alone and how badly it had gone, and about Lily at age 6, telling him the boat he'd just spent 3 weeks restoring was "a little boring, Dad, but I think it has potential." Clara listened, the way she did everything fully without dividing her attention, like what he was saying was the most important thing in the room. At some point, the wind dropped and the rain slowed, and Jake realized it was past 9 o'clock, and Lily would be settled at Mrs. Carver's for the night, and the storm had passed through faster than the forecast suggested. "I should let you get home," Clara said, but she didn't move off the workbench. "You should probably head out before the roads get busy," Jake said, but he didn't move either. They sat in the quiet that followed the storm, the kind of quiet that has texture, that has all the sound of the last several hours pressed into the silence. "The meeting is in 10 days, Clara said. "I know. Victor's lawyers sent another filing this morning. They're arguing that my father lacked the authority to assign trust shares without board approval at the time of the original charter." She said it evenly, but her hands were flat on her knees and the knuckles were slightly white. "My attorney says it's weak, but weak arguments in front of the right judge can become something else." Jake turned to look at her. "What do you need?" "I need the next 10 days to hold together," she said. "I need the shareholders who are wavering to stay put. I need Victor to not find another angle I haven't seen yet." She paused. "And I need—" She stopped. "What?" he said. She looked at him. The storm light through the workshop windows made everything softer, and her face in that light was tired and real and more open than he'd seen it yet. "I need this," she said quietly. "Whatever this is. I need to know it's real, and I'm not building it out of stress and loneliness and the fact that you were the first honest thing that happened to me in a year." The honesty of it landed on Jake like a physical weight. He sat with it for a moment. Then he said, "It's real." "You're sure?" "I was sure the night at the dock," he said. "I've been trying to talk myself out of sure ever since, and it hasn't worked, so I'm going with sure." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she breathed out slowly, and the tension in her hands released, and she nodded once. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. They sat together a little longer in the quiet after the storm. Two people on a workbench in a boatyard with 10 hard days ahead of them, and something between them that was real and fragile and new and strong enough, maybe if they were careful, if they were honest to hold. The 10 days before the shareholder meeting were a different kind of storm. No wind, no rain, just the slow, suffocating pressure of something building underground that you couldn't see but could absolutely feel. Jake felt it every morning when he unlocked the yard gate and looked down the dock at the boats he'd spent years keeping afloat for people who now might lose their contracts if Victor Randall got what he wanted. He felt it when Pete Calloway called on a Tuesday to say that 2 more harbor operators had quietly told him they were reconsidering their shareholder positions. Not because they wanted to, because they were scared. Because Victor's people had done their work well, had planted the idea that Clara's leadership was sentimental, backward-looking, that the future of the waterfront was development and tourism revenue, and that anyone who stood in the way of that was going to get left behind. "Fear is a better sales tool than money," Dawson said when Jake told him. "Always has been." "Can we do anything about it?" Dawson thought for a moment. "You could talk to them." Jake looked at him. "Me? You're not just a voter anymore, Jake. You're the man Thomas Beckett trusted. People on this harbor knew Thomas. They respected him. You showing up and saying what you know that means something different than a lawyer filing or a board statement." He paused. "You're the one person in this situation that Victor can't buy or threaten because you don't want anything from either side except what's right. People can feel that." Jake sat with that for a long moment. He thought about what Clara had said, the first honest thing that happened to me in a year. He thought about Thomas Beckett's letter, the careful handwriting, the way a man who barely knew him had seen something worth trusting. "Set up the calls," he said. He spent the next 3 days on the phone. Not with speeches, not with arguments, just conversations. He called Pete Calloway and 3 other operators he'd known for years, men who had worked this harbor their whole lives the way he had. He didn't tell them how to vote. He told them what Thomas Beckett had written. He told them what the Heritage Restoration Project meant for the kind of work they all did. He told them that a waterfront turned into a real estate platform didn't need boat repairers or riggers or any of them, and that Victor knew it and was counting on them being too scared to say it out loud. 2 of the 4 told him directly they were staying with Clara. The other 2 said they needed to think. 2 out of 4 is better than 0 out of 4, Dawson said. The 2 who said they'd think are going to go with whoever feels inevitable, Jake said, which means we need the meeting itself to feel like Clara wins before the votes are counted. And how do you do that? Jake looked at the rolled drawing still sitting on the corner of his workbench. "I think I need to finish something," he said. He worked on the drawings for 4 straight nights after Lily went to bed. He sat at the kitchen table with the restoration plans spread out, and his grandfather's old drafting tools that he'd kept in a tin in the closet for 15 years, and he drew. Not just the hull profiles and the rigging plans that were already there. He added construction specifications, material sourcing, a phased restoration timeline, cost projections built from real numbers he pulled from the work he did every day. He turned the drawings into something that wasn't just beautiful, but buildable, practical. A real program on paper, the way his grandfather had taught him. If you can draw it, you understand it. He brought it to Clara 4 days before the meeting. She was in her office when he arrived, standing at her desk rather than sitting her reading glasses on 3 different documents spread in front of her with her attorney on speakerphone. She held up one finger when he walked in without looking up. "I understand the filing is weak," she was saying, "but I need to know if Judge Harmon has any prior relationship with Randall's firm before we walk in there Friday." Her attorney said something Jake couldn't hear clearly. "Find out," Clara said. "Today." She ended the call, pulled off her glasses, and looked at Jake. For a second, she just looked at him the way she sometimes did when he arrived unexpectedly, like she was recalibrating from whatever she'd been carrying before he walked in. Then her eyes dropped to the tube under his arm. "Are those teas finished?" he said. He spread them on the conference table. All of it, every drawing complete now. The construction notes, the timeline, the numbers. Clara stood over them and went quiet in the way she did when something was actually reaching her. Her hand moved to the edge of the main hull drawing and stopped just short of touching it, the same gesture as before. "Jake," she said. "It's a real program," he said. "Not a concept, not a proposal deck. A working plan from first assessment through final launch with real cost figures and a realistic 3-year timeline." He pointed to the phased breakdown. First vessel in the water inside 18 months, built here in this harbor by people who already live and work here. She looked up at him. "You did all this in 4 nights. You didn't sleep." "I slept some." She looked back at the drawings for a long moment. Then she said, "I want to present this at the meeting. That's why I finished it. With you there, standing up in front of those shareholders and presenting it yourself." She met his eyes. "Not me introducing your work. You presenting it. Your voice, your knowledge, your name on it." He held her gaze. "Clara, I'm a boat repairman. You are a naval architect who spent 15 years repairing other people's boats instead of building his own." Her voice was firm, not harsh, the voice she used when she was saying something that was going to land whether he was ready for it or not. "There's a difference, and it matters, and you need to stop pretending they're the same thing." The room was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. She almost smiled. "You say that a lot." "It's usually the right answer." She gathered the drawings carefully, exactly as carefully as he would have, and rolled them with the same respect for the paper. "I need 2 hours with my attorney this afternoon," she said. "Can you come back at 6? We need to walk through the meeting sequence together." "I'll be here at 6. He was there at 5:50. She was already at the conference table with her attorney, a compact, sharp-eyed woman named Adrienne Walsh, who shook Jake's hand with the grip of someone who had been fighting in rooms like this for 30 years and had won most of them. "Mr. Mercer," Adrienne said, "I've read the trust document thoroughly. Your 4% is legally unimpeachable. Victor's filing is a delay tactic. The judge saw through it this afternoon." She said it with the flat confidence of someone reporting a weather forecast. "The votes are valid. The question is whether they're enough." "Where do we stand?" Jake asked. Adrienne spread a single sheet on the table. Names, percentages, notations. "As of this morning, Victor has committed support representing 41% of eligible votes. Clara holds 38% of direct and allied shares. Your 4% puts the aligned position at 42. There are 15% in uncommitted or soft positions. So we need the room," Jake said. "We need the room to move," Adrienne confirmed. "We need the shareholders who are wavering to see something in that meeting that makes staying with Clara feel like the obvious forward-looking choice, not just the loyal one. Loyalty doesn't hold when people are scared about their investments." She looked at Jake's drawings, which Clara had set at the end of the table. "This helps, considerably, but you're going to have to sell it." Jake looked at the drawings. At 2 years of his grandfather's teaching, 6 years of abandonment, 4 nights of finishing what had been left unfinished. At a program that could keep 20 families employed on this harbor for a decade if it ran right. "I can sell it," he said. The morning of the shareholder meeting arrived gray and cool, the harbor flat and quiet after the storm's passage. Jake put on the one good suit he owned, charcoal bought for Rachel's sister's wedding 8 years ago, still fit because he'd never stopped working with his hands, and stood in front of the bathroom mirror and did not think about the last time he'd worn it. Lily appeared in the doorway behind him in her pajamas. "You look different," she said. "It's just a suit." "No." She studied him with her mother's eyes. "You look like you're going somewhere that matters." He turned and looked at his daughter. This 10-year-old person who had survived the worst thing a child could survive, and still managed to be funny and sharp and full of life, and felt the familiar ache and pride that came with her presence, mixed now with something new, something that felt like forward motion. "I am," he said. "Is it about the company, lady?" Lily asked. Jake picked up his jacket from the chair. "Go eat breakfast." "It's totally about the company, lady." Lily said, and disappeared down the hallway. He arrived at the Beckett and Company boardroom 40 minutes before the scheduled start. It was a big room-long table, 20 chairs, a presentation screen at one end, a row of windows looking out over the harbor that Jake suspected Thomas Beckett had insisted on specifically. Clara was already there with Adrian, both of them standing over a legal pad, talking in the low, rapid cadence of two people who had been through the same fight before and knew where every step fell. Clara looked up when Jake walked in. She'd dressed carefully. Dark navy, tailored her father's company colors without being theatrical about it. She looked exactly like what she was the right person to be running this company, visible in every detail if you knew how to look. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Ready," he said, which was mostly true. "Victor's already here," Adrian said. "He's in the lobby with 3 attorneys and what appears to be a professionally designed presentation deck." She looked at Jake's rolled drawings under his arm with something that might have been amusement. "Old school versus new money. I've seen worse dynamics work in our favor." Victor Randall entered the boardroom at 9:58, 2 minutes before the scheduled start, which Jake recognized as a calculated move. Arrive last. Let the room feel your entrance. He was taller than Jake expected, mid-60s, silver-haired, the kind of man who wore his success with the ease of someone who'd been wearing it for decades. He had 3 attorneys behind him, and the particular confidence of a man who had counted the votes and liked his number. He saw Jake, and something flickered across his face, not quite surprise, but a recalibration. He knew who Jake was. He'd known since Adrian filed the trust documentation. He'd tried to challenge it legally, and failed. But seeing Jake in the room in a suit with rolled drawings under his arm, that was a variable his attorneys hadn't fully accounted for, and Victor Randall was smart enough to know it. He nodded at Jake with the professional courtesy of a man who didn't intend to lose but acknowledged a worthy obstacle. Jake nodded back with the steady calm of a man who had stood watch in the South China Sea at 2 in the morning and understood what it meant to hold a position. The meeting was called to order. Victor went first. His presentation was polished. His numbers were real. His argument was built on the language of modernization and competitive positioning and maximizing shareholder value. He spoke for 20 minutes. He was good. Jake could admit that Victor was genuinely good in a room. He knew how to make fear sound like opportunity and loyalty sound like sentimentality. When Victor finished, Jake could see 2 of the wavering shareholders nodding slowly, and the dread in his chest tightened. Clara spoke next. She didn't use slides. She stood at the head of the table and spoke from notes she'd written by hand, her father's habit Jake had learned, and she talked about what Beckett and Company was built to do, not what it was worth on paper. She was precise and passionate in equal measure, and she was honest about the challenges in a way that Victor hadn't been, and Jake watched the room respond to that honesty the way it always did when someone stopped managing the audience and just told the truth. Then she looked at Jake and nodded. He stood up. He unrolled the drawings on the table. And he talked not like a presenter, not like a man performing confidence, but like a man who understood what he was talking about from the ground up, from the keel joint to the masthead, from the first pencil line to the last coat of varnish. He talked about the vessels, about the history in them, about the 23 people currently employed within a half-mile of this building whose livelihoods were directly connected to the kind of work this program would generate. He put real numbers on the table, not projections built on optimism, but figures grounded in what he knew about what restoration work actually cost and what it actually returned. He talked for 15 minutes. He didn't look at Victor once. When he finished, he rolled the drawings back up and sat down. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Arthur Gaines, 70 years old, 6% shareholder, a man who had worked with Thomas Beckett for 25 years, and whose soft, committed position had been the one Jake was most uncertain about, leaned forward and said, "Tom always said there were 2 kinds of people on this harbor, the ones who knew what boats were worth and the ones who knew what boats were for." He looked at Jake. "I think I just heard the second kind." Victor started to speak. One of his attorneys touched his arm. The vote was called. Jake watched the room as the tally was taken, watched faces he'd tried to read for 2 weeks, resolving into decisions, watched the wavering positions land one by one. Pete Calloway had come through. Arthur Gaines had come through. One of the 2 remaining soft positions came through. The other went to Victor. Adrienne wrote the final number on her legal pad and slid it across to Clara. Clara read it. Her face didn't change that composure was real. It was in the bone, but her hand resting on the table turned slightly palm up. An open gesture, like releasing something she'd been gripping for a long time. Victor looked at his attorney. The attorney looked at the numbers. Victor sat back in his chair, with the stillness of a man who had lost and was deciding how to lose. "The motion fails," the board chair said. "Clara Beckett retains operational leadership of Beckett and Company. The meeting is adjourned." The room moved chairs, pushed back conversations, breaking out the particular energy of a decision made. Adrienne was already on her feet. Victor and his team were gathering their materials with the professional efficiency of people who had lost before and knew how it worked. Victor stopped beside Jake on his way to the door, looked at him directly. "Smart play with the drawings," Victor said. "It wasn't generous, but it was honest." "Thomas always did know how to pick his people." "He did," Jake said. Victor left. Jake stood there for a moment in the clearing room. He thought about Thomas Beckett's letter in his jacket pocket. He'd carried it to every meeting since Clara gave it to him without exactly deciding to the way you carry certain things without ceremony, because they've simply become part of what you bring. He thought about a hull that needed sealing. A dock at midnight. 11 seconds and a sentence he was never supposed to say. He felt a hand close around his, not dramatically, not publicly, just quietly from the side. Clara's hand, her fingers lacing through his with the certainty of someone who had decided to stop waiting for the right moment and had simply chosen this one. He closed his hand around hers. "Thursday," she said quietly. He looked at her. "Thursday. You said dinner, when this was over." A pause. "It's over." He looked at her, at the exhaustion lifting off her face like weather clearing, at the composed woman and the real woman both present at once, at the person his whole unlikely trajectory through the last 3 weeks had been moving toward. "Thursday," he said, and this time when the corner of her mouth moved, she let it become the full thing, the real smile, unguarded and warm, the one he'd been waiting to see since a storm-lit workshop and a coffee cup, and the sound of her actually laughing. He held on to her hand and looked out the window at the harbor. His grandfather had worked, and his father had worked, and he had worked. The water catching the late morning light the way it always did, indifferent and beautiful and older than all of them, still worth something, still worth everything. Thursday came the way good things sometimes do, quietly, without announcement, slipping in behind all the noise of everything that had come before it. Jake picked Lily up from school at 3:15, the same as every Thursday, the same battered Ford, the same parking spot at the curb, where the oak tree dropped its leaves on the windshield from October through December. Lily got in, threw her backpack on the seat between them, and looked at him with the immediate diagnostic assessment she performed every afternoon, reading his face, the way he'd taught her to read weather, looking for what was actually there beneath whatever expression he was wearing on top. "You're nervous," she said. "I'm not nervous. Your left hand is doing the thing on the steering wheel." He looked at his left hand. It was tapping a slow rhythm on the wheel that he had not consciously started. He stopped it. "I have a dinner tonight," he said. Lily was quiet for 3 seconds. "With the company lady. Her name is Clara." "I know her name." Lily picked up her backpack and held it in her lap, looking out the windshield. "Is it a date or a dinner? What's the difference? A dinner is when you talk about work. A date is when you wear the good jacket and you're nervous for no reason." She paused. "You're wearing the good jacket." Jake looked down at himself. He had in fact put on the good jacket, the one without the tear in the sleeve, without particularly deciding to. He looked back at the road. "It's dinner," he said. "Okay," Lily said. They drove in silence for a block. Then she said, "Dad." "Yeah, Mom would have liked her." She said it simply, the way she sometimes said things that were too big for the words she used, just set them down in the space between them and let them sit there. "I heard you tell Dawson she came to the harbor in the storm to help. Mom would have thought that was really cool." Jake kept his eyes on the road. His throat did the thing it sometimes did, the tightening that came without warning that he'd learned to breathe through without letting it become something that scared her. "Yeah," he said when he could. "She would have." Lily nodded satisfied and pulled out her reading book. The conversation was over in her mind, which meant it was complete. He loved that about her, the way she said the true thing, and then released it. No drama, no lingering, just truth placed carefully, and then moved past. He drove home with his left hand still on the wheel. He picked Clara up at 7. She lived in a restored row house 6 blocks from the harbor. Tall windows, worn brick, the kind of building that had stood through enough history to stop being impressed by any of it. She came out the front door before he reached it, which he'd expected. She wasn't a woman who waited for things to come to her if she could move toward them instead. She was wearing a dark green dress, simple, cut her hair down in a way he hadn't seen before. No portfolio, no jacket with pockets full of documents, just herself in a green dress in the October evening. He stopped on the front walk. "You're staring," she said. "I'm looking," he said. "There's a difference." She almost smiled, then let it become the real thing. "Where are we going?" "There's a place on the harbor. Nothing fancy." He paused. "Booth's Good Fish. The owner's been running it for 30 years, and he still writes the specials on a chalkboard by hand." "That sounds exactly right," she said. They walked to the truck, and he opened the passenger door, and she got in without comment, and he went around to the driver's side and got in, and they drove through the Charleston evening with the windows down, because October in Charleston still didn't require windows up, and the city moved past them in its particular way. Warm, light, old buildings, the smell of the water threading through everything. "Lily asked about you," Jake said. Clara turned to look at him. "What did she say?" "She said her mother would have liked you." He kept his eyes on the road. "I thought you should know that." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight, but not discomfort. The kind that meant what he'd said was landing the way it needed to. "That means a lot," Clara said quietly. "More than she knows." "She knows more than she lets on," Jake said. "She always has. Always." The restaurant was called Harlan's, and it had been on that particular corner since before Jake was born. The owner, a broad-shouldered man in his late 60s named Dell, greeted Jake with the particular warmth of someone who had fed him through various difficult years, without ever making a production of it a handshake. A good table by the window. The kind of welcome that said, "I know you," without requiring explanation. Dell looked at Clara with open curiosity. Jake introduced them. Dell shook her hand and said, "Thomas Beckett used to come in here every Friday." He said it simply, not as a bridge builder or a calculated observation, just as a true thing. "Good man, always ordered the same thing, sat at the bar and talked to whoever was there." He paused. "You've got his eyes." Clara's hand tightened briefly around Dell's. "Thank you," she said. "People don't say that often enough." Dell left them with menus and the kind of tact that only came from decades of watching people sit across from each other and figure things out. They ordered both the fish, different preparations, a shared appetizer, no wine because Jake was driving, and Clara said she preferred to remember the evening clearly, which made him smile. They talked easily the way they'd been talking for weeks now, but without the weight of shareholder meetings and legal filings and tropical storms pressing against every word. Just conversation. Just two people in a booth with good food and the harbor visible through the glass. She told him about growing up on the water, her father waking her at 5 in the morning on Saturdays to help scrub the deck of the family boat, how she'd resented it at 8 and missed it desperately at 25 when he was sick and couldn't do it anymore. Jake told her about his grandfather taking him to the yard for the first time at 12, putting a pencil in his hand and a hull diagram in front of him, and saying, "Draw what you see, not what you think you see." They talked about work the way people talk about it, when it's genuinely what they care about, rather than what they do not as a topic, but as a thread running through everything else. At some point, Clara said, "I talked to the board yesterday about the Heritage program." Jake looked up from his plate. "And?" "They approved the initial funding, enough to start the first vessel assessment and begin sourcing materials." She held his gaze. "They want your name on the program documentation as lead designer. Officially." He set his fork down. "Clara, don't tell me you're not qualified. We've had that conversation." "I was going to say thank you," he said. She paused. "Oh, although I also think I'm qualified." "There he is," she said, and the real laugh came unguarded. Warm, the one that had hit him somewhere unexpected in a storm-dark workshop, and hadn't stopped hitting him since. He sat across from her in Dell's restaurant and watched her laugh, and thought about a filing cabinet drawer left open, and a tube of drawings that had been rolled and unrolled more times in the last 3 weeks than in the 6 years before them, and a letter from a man who had watched him for 10 minutes and decided something worth deciding. He thought about how strange it was the way things turned. A broken hull, a gala, 11 seconds a sentence he wasn't supposed to say. The whole chain of it, each link as unlikely as the last, adding up to this table, this woman this evening. "What are you thinking?" Clara asked. "I'm thinking about the Harriet Blue," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "Right now. Stay with me." He leaned forward slightly. 6 weeks in dry dock. Harbor Master clears her your head of operations. Clears her everybody with official authority says she's fine. And she almost wasn't. The fracture was there the whole time, it just needed someone to get close enough and care enough to find it. Clara was quiet watching him. "I think that's the only way anything good gets found," he said. "Somebody has to get close enough to look, and care enough to say what they see, even when it's easier not to." She held his gaze across the table for a long moment. In the window behind her, the harbor lights were doing what they always did in the October dark, dancing on the water, making everything look like it might be worth something. "My father wrote about you 3 times, she said. "Did I tell you what the last entry said? You said you were still figuring out what to do with it." "I figured it out." She reached into the small bag beside her and put a folded piece of paper on the table between them, photocopied her father's handwriting clear and deliberate. She pushed it toward him. He unfolded it, read it. "There is a man at Mercer's Yard who looks at boats the way I used to look at everything before I learned to look at spreadsheets instead. He sees what's actually there. Not what's supposed to be there. Not what the inspection says is there, what is actually structurally truly there. I don't know what his life is like. I don't know what it's cost him. But I know this harbor needs men like that, more than it needs men like Victor Randall. I put his name on the trust because I believe in what I see in him. I hope Clara finds her way to believing in it too." Jake folded the paper, set it on the table, looked out at the harbor for a moment. "He was right," Clara said quietly, "about what he saw." "He was a good judge of boats," Jake said. "He was a good judge of people." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. "So am I." He turned his hand over and held hers. They walked back along the harbor afterward, not to the truck immediately, just walking the way you walked when you weren't ready for an evening to be over and you didn't want to manufacture a reason to extend it. You just wanted to keep moving through it a little longer. The water was calm. The lights were on in the restaurants and bars along the waterfront, and the boats at the docks moved with the slow, patient rhythm of things that knew how to wait. Jake stopped at the railing above Slip 7. Clara stopped beside him. "This is where you were," she said. "This is where I was." She looked down at the dock. "On your knees, with a sealant brush. At 11 o'clock at night. And you said the most unexpected thing anyone has said to me in years." She glanced at him sideways. "To a woman in a $4,000 dress, from your knees." "I've never claimed to have good timing." "Your timing was perfect," she said. "I had just spent 3 hours inside that party being handled by Victor's people, by board members, hedging their positions, by people who wanted something from me, or wanted to protect themselves from me. And I walked out to get some air, and a man I'd never met just—" She stopped. "Just said a true thing, without an angle, without wanting anything." She looked at him. "Do you know how rare that is?" "Your father thought it was rare," Jake said. "I always just thought it was the baseline." "It should be," she said. "It isn't." He looked out at the water. At the dock, where 6 weeks ago he'd been a widowed boat repairman with a sleeping daughter in his truck, and a life that had gotten very small and very manageable and very safe. He thought about safe. About the careful walls and the working routine, and the filing cabinet he'd never opened because the drawings inside it were connected to a version of himself he hadn't been sure still existed. "I was going to be fine," he said. "Before all this, I had a plan. Keep the yard running. Raise Lily. Don't want anything too big." He paused. "It was a reasonable plan." "It sounds like a very lonely plan," Clara said. "It was a very lonely plan," he agreed. "But lonely felt safer than wanting things you couldn't hold on to." She turned to face him. The harbor light was in her eyes, and her expression was open and direct, the way it always was when she stopped managing and just was. "You can hold on to this," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. At the woman who had driven herself to every meeting, who had come to the dock in a storm with a coiled line over her shoulder, who had spread his unfinished drawings on a conference table like they mattered, because to her they did. Who had put her hand in his in a boardroom after a battle won, and said simply, "Thursday," and meant it, and kept it. "I know," he said. He leaned in and kissed her, not dramatically, not after a long build-up, just the way true things happened between two people who had both been honest long enough to earn it. Her hand came up to his jacket lapel, not pulling him closer, just holding the way you held something you'd been careful with and intended to keep being careful with. When they stepped back, they stood close together at the harbor railing, and the water moved below them, the way it had moved for 200 years, and would move for 200 more, patient and indifferent and beautiful. "Lily is going to be insufferable about this," Jake said. "Good," Clara said. "She should be." He laughed, and that surprised him the way good things still sometimes did, catching him without his guard up, reminding him that his chest was still capable of the full range. 3 months later, the first restoration vessel arrived at Mercer Marine. She was a 1941 friendship sloop named Constance, 42 feet of compromised but salvageable history. Her hull hogged in the middle and her mast pulled, but her bones fundamentally sound. Jake stood on the dock with Dawson and 2 new hires, young guys, one straight out of vocational school, one who'd been doing fiberglass repair up in Georgetown and wanted to come home, and looked at her. "She's a mess," one of the new hires said. "She's a starting point," Jake said. "That's better." Inside the workshop, pinned to the wall above the main bench where everyone could see them, were the finished drawings. Full-size, framed in cheap metal frames from the hardware store, but present, visible. His name in the title block of each one, J. Mercer Designer. Lily came by after school that first day, the way she'd started doing not every day, but enough. She walked around the Constance with her hands in her hoodie pocket, looking at the hull the way Jake had taught her to look at things, tilting her head, thinking before speaking. "What was she like?" Lily asked. "Before." "Beautiful," Jake said. "She'll be beautiful again." Lily looked at him sideways. "Are you talking about the boat?" "Yes," Jake said firmly. "Sure?" Lily said, in the voice she'd inherited from a woman who had also known exactly when he was telling the convenient version. Clara arrived at 4:30, same dark blue sedan, parking in what had become, without any formal agreement, her spot near the workshop door. She got out with a folder under her arm, the funding documentation for Phase 2, and walked toward them, and Lily turned and watched her come, and then looked at Jake with an expression that was pure Rachel knowing warm, and just a little bit smug. "Don't," Jake said. "I didn't say anything," Lily said. Clara reached them, looked at the Constance, and said, "She came in on her own keel." "Towed in," Jake said, "but she rowed well." "Like she wanted to get here," Clara said. "Something like that." Clara looked at the boat for a moment, and Jake looked at Clara, and Lily looked at both of them with the profound satisfaction of a 10-year-old who had been correct about something important and was quietly celebrating. The 4 of them, Dawson included, leaning on the dock box with his coffee, stood in the late afternoon harbor light, and the Constance sat in her cradle, battered and promising, waiting to become what she'd always been meant to be. Some things healed slowly. Some things healed in the exact right amount of time. Jake Mercer had spent 4 years learning the difference between those two things, and he had finally fully come to understand it. He had built his walls carefully, tended his manageable life, loved his daughter fiercely, and waited without knowing. He was waiting for the thing that would ask him to be larger than his grief. It had come in the form of a harbor gala, an 11-second conversation, a woman who came to the dock in a storm, and a letter from a man who had seen him clearly in 10 minutes and trusted what he saw. Jake Mercer had been found the way the fracture in the Harriet Blue had been found by someone who got close enough, cared enough, and said what was true. And this time, he did not roll the drawings back up and put them away. This time, he let the work continue.